Snow slammed violently against Margaret. Hale's small wooden cabin in rural Montana. The storm had grown stronger with every passing hour, shaking the windows and burying the porch beneath thick layers of ice and snow. Inside 72-year-old, Margaret sat quietly beside her fireplace wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The house felt colder than usual that night, not just from the storm, but from the silence she had lived with for years. Just as she lifted her cup of tea, she heard something unusual through the wind. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the trees. It was softer, weaker, almost like a cry struggling to survive the freezing air outside. Margaret slowly stood and walked toward the front door, her heart beating slightly faster. She hesitated for a moment before turning the handle, unsure of what she might find waiting on the other side. When she opened the door, her breath caught instantly. Two large German shepherd dogs were sitting on her porch completely covered in snow. Their bodies trembled violently and their tired eyes looked up at her as if begging for warmth. Their fur was stiff from ice, and their ribs were slightly visible beneath. Their soaked coats, they didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply sat there in silence, shivering against the brutal winter storm. "Oh my goodness, you poor babies," she whispered, softly kneeling down despite the freezing wind. Without thinking twice, she reached forward and gently guided them inside her small, warm cabin. "Oh my goodness, you poor babies," she whispered softly, kneeling down despite the freezing wind. Without thinking twice, she reached forward and gently guided them inside her small, warm cabin. The fire crackled loudly as she shut the door behind them. The dogs stepped inside, cautiously scanning the room carefully. Their movements were calm, controlled almost too, disciplined for animals that had been wandering alone in a snowstorm. Margaret quickly grabbed thick blankets and wrapped them around the trembling dogs. She placed more wood into the fireplace and turned the heat, higher, determined to bring life back into their frozen bodies. As she prepared warm broth on the stove, she noticed something strange. The dogs sat perfectly still, watching her every move with alert, intelligent eyes. They didn't behave like strays. They behaved like they had been trained. The dogs stayed close to the fire, their eyes never leaving Margaret. She fed them warm broth and some leftover chicken, watching as they carefully sniffed the food before taking tiny bites. Their behavior was too calm, too intelligent for ordinary stray dogs. Margaret noticed their posture, every movement precise, disciplined. When she gestured to sit, both dogs obeyed immediately, as if they had been trained. She whispered to herself, "These aren't ordinary strays. They're military or police dogs." The night passed slowly. Margaret couldn't sleep, her mind racing. Every so often, she would glance at the two dogs lying silently near her chair. She felt a strange connection, as if they understood her loneliness and offered comfort in return. Morning came with an unexpected noise. A distant engine, then another. Margaret froze. She peeked outside. Snow covered everything, but in the distance, flashing red and blue lights reflected on the white snow. 4 police cars had stopped directly outside her cabin. Officers stepped out cautiously, scanning the snow-covered yard. Margaret's hands trembled. Her heart pounded. How could this be? She had only tried to save 2 helpless dogs from the storm. Loud knocks shook the cabin door. "Ma'am, police!" shouted a voice. Margaret swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. Slowly, carefully, she opened the door. The 2 dogs immediately standing at her side, alert and protective. An officer stepped forward and asked, "Ma'am, have you seen 2 military K9 dogs? They escaped from a nearby transport last night." Margaret's eyes widened. Her gaze drifted to the 2 dogs now standing firmly beside her, waiting silently. The officer explained the dog's situation. They were highly trained military K9 units, recently retired. Their previous handler had died in service, and since then, they had refused to eat or respond to anyone until Margaret opened her door last night. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She whispered, "They were freezing. I couldn't leave them out there." The officer's expression softened. He glanced at the dogs, noticing how they stayed beside her, protective and calm. He nodded slowly, a small smile forming on his face. One of the officers knelt down, calling their names softly, "Rex, Titan." Both dogs did not move toward the police. Instead, they pressed closer to Margaret, as if making it clear she was their choice. The officers exchanged surprised, puzzled looks. "They've never done this before," whispered an officer. Margaret stroked their heads gently. She realized these dogs had found trust again, comforted by her kindness and warmth. Something deep, invisible, had passed between them overnight. The lead officer made a phone call. After a short discussion, he looked back and said, "If you're willing, we'd like you to officially take care of them." Margaret's hands trembled. She nodded through tears. "Yes, of course." The officers packed up, leaving the cabin quiet again. But this time, the silence was different. It was warm. It was filled with trust, with companionship, and with the quiet heartbeat of two loyal dogs. Resting safely near, Margaret sighed. Weeks later, the cabin had transformed. The dogs were stronger, healthier, more alert. Margaret laughed softly as she watched them play in the snow. The small wooden house no longer felt lonely. It now had life, warmth, and the quiet joy of companionship. Every morning, Margaret would walk through the snow with Rex and Titan by her side. Neighbors stopped to stare. Some smiled. Some shook their heads in disbelief. An old widow with 2 retired military dogs. Yet somehow it all seemed completely natural. Completely right evenings were peaceful. The fireplace glowed warmly as the dogs rested beside her. Sometimes Margaret would sit quietly, reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought these loyal, intelligent animals into her lonely life. She realized something profound. Sometimes the ones we try to save end up saving us. The dogs' silent presence had filled a void she hadn't realized existed. She smiled softly, stroking Rex's fur as Titan rested his head on her lap. One snowy night, the wind howled outside, echoing through the small Montana woods. Margaret glanced at the 2 dogs, their eyes bright and alert. They were more than companions now. They were guardians, friends and reminders of kindness, trust, and unconditional loyalty. Margaret often thought about that first night. If she hadn't opened the door, if she had hesitated, she might never have found the incredible bond with Rex and Titan. Fate, it seemed, had chosen them all to meet at exactly the right time. The dog's presence brought more than warmth. They brought confidence to Margaret. She walked taller, laughed more, and found joy in daily routines again. Even her neighbors noticed a change. The small cabin was no longer just a house. It was a home alive with life. One morning, a neighbor knocked. "Your dogs, they're incredible," he said. Watching them stand alert, watching over Margaret, she smiled. Quietly nodding, these animals had faced loss and training, fear and cold, yet they had chosen love, and Margaret had chosen them back. Winter passed, and spring arrived. Flowers bloomed near the cabin, snow melted from the trees. Margaret often watched Rex and Titan chase each other in the yard. Their joy was infectious, filling her days with laughter and reminding her that hope always returns even after darkness at night. The cabin glowed with soft firelight. The dogs rested peacefully beside Margaret. Occasionally, she would whisper stories about her past, and they would respond with soft whines or nudges. They were family now, and Margaret felt truly alive for the first time in years. News of the brave widow and her 2 retired military dogs spread slowly through the town. Some came to watch, some to admire, some simply to smile. They saw not just animals, but loyalty, bravery, and the deep, unspoken bond that could exist between humans and dogs. The police who had originally arrived returned one day to check on the dogs. They watched silently, realizing the bond that had formed. Even highly trained military dogs had found peace, warmth, and trust again with a simple act of kindness. I sincerely apologize for not completing the story fully. I will do my best to bring you many more beautiful and engaging stories. I am always ready to work hard for you. Once again, I truly apologize.